Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Qualley, and today we're diving into mindset because I have a really cool guest, Dr. Reiner Kraft, who used to be in computer sciences, and he evolved his way after working with many big tech companies, including Yahoo, to recognize that there was a problem within really awareness and being able to be a more effective, mindful leader. So when you really got to think about what mindfulness is, it's paying attention. It's your ability to focus and to be immersed in whatever the task is that you're doing rather than being distracted or anxious or have too many negative thoughts floating around. And so what he really focused on and he went on a deep dive on is to how to optimize the mindset, to be present. And he systemized it as he is a computer science major. So when he actually utilized his kind of systematic approach, he came up with really cool strategies. I'm going to let him tell this story because I think it's really cool. And we discuss some really cool strategies and ideas for people to actually implement. We talk about the benefits and drawbacks of doing it or not doing it. And we also talk about how it applies to your overall health and well-being. So we have a really cool conversation around mindfulness today, and there's a lot of tangible lessons that you can take with you. So without further ado, here is Dr. Kraft. Good day, Dr. Kraft. How are you, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks, Ron.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you being on my podcast today. I'm really excited to dive in. I think you got a really, really interesting resume, and I'm super fascinated with the realm that you're involved in. But why don't we kind of allow you to introduce yourself to my audience, because I think it's always best told by the person. So tell the audience a little bit about yourself, kind of how you grew up, and then tell them how you kind of got into the field that you're in now currently.
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me here on the show. I think my background is in computer science, professional background. I went into that area in the mid-90s. And so I grew up in Germany, actually, in a small village a little bit north of Frankfurt. And then decided with computer science, after finishing my undergraduate studies, it's a good place to be is California, Silicon Valley. So this is where I went. And then we always said, well, so actually my girlfriend at that point, she joined me there, and we basically enjoyed the California weather and the sun and all that stuff. And we always said, oh, this is kind of cool here. And then I started my professional career. I worked at large tech corporations there, like IBM Research, later Yahoo as well. And we always said, so as long as it makes sense, we stay here in California. And then all of a sudden, 20 years later, we were still there. But then back in 2016, so I moved more and more into tech leadership. And I'm working on cutting edge tech stuff, a lot of innovation. I did filed a lot of patents. I worked on a lot of high tech, really cool products, digital products. My expertise was around web search, information retrieval, and also more scientific background. So I worked on a lot of interesting technology things. And then back in 2016, I decided it's time to do something else. And then I got an offer here in Berlin, Germany, for working for a large tech company as well. They're a major player here in the field of fashion. And I said, oh, this sounds interesting, as basically building up all of the search and personalization technology. I didn't have a lot of background itself on fashion, so for that field was completely new for me. But I thought this is a change of the scenery, let's do it. And then, the last 6-7 years, I did a lot of cool stuff there as well, and working in Berlin. Also did a startup afterwards for Deutsche Bank, some fintech, to basically help them incubate some innovation in the financial space, which I thought, let's see how it goes. But then a few years ago, I launched my own company, the Mindful Leader, which this is what I'm doing now, is focusing on a lot of topics around improving the mind, but also the body, mind and body. And I talk often about a high performance mindset. because I felt that this is really, when I look back these 20, 30 years, this is something, it's so important. I think it's like a basic necessity. And I wish I would have developed, cultivated like a high performance mindset at the beginning of my career, but unfortunately I didn't have that knowledge at that point in time. And so this is a very short summary of some of the stations of my career or with my life.
Well, I think that's a really cool transformation, especially just how you ended up transitioning into, the mindful leader. And so why don't you tell us a little bit more about this mindful leader kind of program that you do? And I'm curious, what really made you want to kind of dive into that? What were kind of the things that evolved that motivation to be like, this is where I really want to drive myself into?
Yeah, sure. Well, the mindful leader was an idea that, since I was in tech leadership, or in general, the idea of leadership, the question always was, what is good leadership? And you need good leadership in whatever you do. If you're an entrepreneur, whatever position you work on, it's actually not just about leading others, it's leading yourself. So personal leadership, this is what it boils down to, personal leadership. And I felt that is so important. But then the question was, how do you know that, how can you develop, or how can you grow into becoming a really good leader? Or, it's just figuring out ways to grow as a leader, achieve leadership mastery. So those questions were on my mind. And about 10 years ago, this was when I was still back in California, it was kind of crazy at that point in time. I was stressed out because I worked long hours, as typically most people did. And I was also teaching in the mornings, or sometimes in the afternoons or evening, at the university in Santa Cruz. And so I had a lecture there, and then running some labs and so on. And so I was pretty much busy around the clock. And at some point, there was a lot of stress. And I felt it, like I went to this point of mental exhaustion at some point. And that was for me a great insight, because I figured what's going on. I felt that these symptoms of the stress, and I know at that point I needed to do something. And this was, at some point, there was a pivotal moment when I basically realized, or increased, I got these glimpses of, I call them now awareness, where I felt, oh man, there is more to all of life, in terms of really becoming more aware of what's going on. And then you actually realize that what you're doing every day, instead of doing most of the stuff on autopilot. So this is where awareness kicks in. And when I did, at that point, I remember Yahoo was offering one of these MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction classes. And so I took it. I had no clue in terms of what mindfulness was, but I just felt keeping an open mind certainly is helpful in that space. And then, so I did it, and it felt good. And again, I realized there is this increasing level of awareness cultivated through mindfulness. And that was the game changer for me, was more awareness. Now, of course, at that point, I didn't know what that was. I just felt like you're more connected to certain things, you're more calm, and things are more smoother, there's less stress, and the mind is actually getting in a calm, peaceful state of mind. And then only years later, I realized this is all basically increased level of awareness. And so that, I felt, is so important, not just for myself, but for all those other leaders around me, because they caused inside the company. There were, of course, big company like Yahoo at that point, there's plenty of leaders out there. And all the big ones, the tech companies, they have thousands of leaders, right? Google, Facebook, and so on. And so I felt that awareness is a critical part of leadership, or personal leadership in general. It's the foundation, actually. But most people lack awareness. And so then that results in a lot of turmoil, a lot of stress, and it may even lead to some toxic environments. at work, and that's what I experienced. And the question then was, how can this be improved, right? How can people, more take advantage of more awareness, and how can they actually cultivate more awareness in their life? And this was my question, because I thought this is like the biggest lever you have in terms of growing as a leader. That was my insight. And then since then, I basically experimented and was curious, is there ways on how to do this more systematically instead of just like more random? Like I felt in my case at the beginning, it was more or less like a random type of dabbling in here, falling into this, experimenting, trial and error. And so can this be done more systematically, also in a data-driven way that you can clearly measure those things, that you know that there is a trajectory, there's a baseline, let's do something, let's cultivate awareness. And that was my interest in the past years, figuring that out. And yeah, it is actually doable. And this is stuff what I'm doing now at the Mindful Leader, is helping other leaders or business professionals to take advantage and cultivate more awareness so that they become, it's pretty much becoming the best version of themselves, right? But becoming more calm, more focused, more connected to the present moment. And it's like the superpowers, right? Cultivating these superpowers, but doing it in a systematic and data-driven way. I think that's the thing that is probably a little bit unique to my approach, because I mean, mindfulness nowadays is a big industry. There's so many different things out there, but I haven't seen people like me basically doing this more in a geeky, data-driven way. But it works very well. And then when I got this insight that it worked very well, then I was figuring out, well, how then let's see, how can this be actually, how can this scale, or how can I get people on board and help them, and so that they can take advantage. And this is what I was experimenting with in the past years, basically.
I really love how you nail down like people are unaware, and I think some people might take offense to that, but like they don't really appreciate what mindfulness is. And I'd heard it really summarized very well one day, and they just said it's paying attention, and it's paying attention to the present moment, as you keep saying. So mindfulness, for those who haven't really actually dove into it, it just sounds kind of weird. It sounds very woo-woo, but probably someone listening to this podcast could be driving. Well, you're probably not aware you're driving, right? And so that's lack of awareness in being able to bring the best out of each moment. You have to be aware in each moment. You have to want to be a part of each moment rather than trying to multitask. And we get into this old culture, which I'm certain that you're familiar with in the tech space, but in a lot of spaces in the last 20 years, it was all about hustle. And so being able to multitask was actually seen as a good thing. And now we're coming more around of it. And you're like, no, like let's do one thing at a time, but do one thing very well. And especially I can imagine as a leader, if you're not aware of your environment and the people in your environment, that's where a lot of consequences happen. So I'm really curious, and so because you're very data driven, and I'm assuming that comes from your computer science background, that you like that data. So what are some major kind of tactics that you recommend people pay attention to? Overarching, what kind of systems do you recommend people utilize when they want to have more of a mindful approach to their life, and especially as being a leader in any sort of realm in their life?
Yeah, good question. And of course, there can be very long answers. So I'm trying to, I think, to bring it to the point. There are KPIs, key performance indicators for the mind. And yeah, this comes back to my background as a scientist, as an engineer. I like numbers. And there is the saying, I mean, how can you improve something if you can't measure it? And if I want to cultivate more awareness, it always felt to me very fuzzy. Right? So I did mindfulness, meditation, body scans, and so all this good stuff, and I learned it and it felt good. But I couldn't get a good sense now. Yeah, sure, I feel much calmer afterwards. But this feeling of or being aware, I felt very, very aware in this moment when I meditated. But the question is, can I keep this feeling of or being connected with the present moment, being present, not just in the meditation or during these mindfulness exercises? Can I make the whole day like this? And it was clear then that to measure the amount of awareness or this level of present awareness, I refer to it as an LPA, is basically can be defined as the time over the course of the day, your waking time, that you are fully connected to the present moment. So then it was clear it's a percentage. There is the waking time, like let's say 16 hours, and then there is a fraction of the time where you're fully aware. And then the unit I came up with is basically mindful minutes, right? And actually there's devices out there. I use it as Oura Ring. There is other devices, smartphones, smartwatches. And many of them actually nowadays, they track mindfulness, and how they track it is usually, indeed, is mindful minutes. So it's something that looks like happened in parallel. When I was talking about mindful minutes, this was way earlier than there were these devices. But it was this idea that if you're for 1 minute fully connected to the present moment, if you're fully aware, you're fully here, not somewhere in your thoughts thinking about the past or basically planning some scenarios in the future. No, you're really here. Maybe in this case, listening to what we're talking about, and being present. And if you do this for 1 minute, then you have accumulated one mindful minute. And then it's like collecting, right? It's collecting more of these minutes. If you can collect 10 minutes of the course of the day, that's great. Maybe you can collect even 20 of these mindful minutes. And when I did the math, if you think about 16 hours is roughly about 1,000 minutes. So 10 minutes represents roughly about 1%. And so your LPA, your level of present awareness, in that case would be 1%. And the rest of the day, you're basically 99% or 98%. You're basically identified with your thinking, right? You're like this daydreaming mode, right? It's basically not connected to the present moment. And you feel that if you're not connected to the present moment, it's the default state of mind for many. And when I started working with many leaders here in tech and was coaching them, so as a coach, mentor, trainer, this was a very interesting experience at the beginning, because we're trying to calculate, help these guys to calculate or establish a baseline. So I said, here's the formula for awareness, use it. And now over the next 2 or 3 weeks, I want you just try to do your best job, track those mindful minutes. And of course, in the first week, then there is questions. Does this count as a mindful minute? Is that a mindful minute? And then usually people have to set up some spreadsheet. So I gave them some templates for these things to make it easy. And then they were experimenting. And after the second or third week, usually, it was not that much work. But then they got a good sense of how many mindful minutes they accumulated each day on average. And yeah, there was, I would say, 20 minutes, sometimes a little bit more, but also sometimes less. So 2% was the LPA on average so far when I worked with these guys at the beginning. That was the default state. So it's a very low level of awareness. And that's, for me, actually didn't come as a surprise. I figured the number can't be that high when I look around. But it was good to really see this in terms of numbers. But the cool thing then was, since these guys were then motivated when they see the number wasn't that high, maybe some had 3% or 4% or whatever, but it was usually a relatively low number. And then I told them, look, let's go, let's experiment and let's work on this in the next 3 months. Let's see how we can get this number up. Let's see, can we get it up more than 10%? Maybe even 15% or 20%, because that would be a 10x increase. And a 10x change usually is significant. And so they said, yeah, that's cool, let's do it. And so then I helped them step by step over 3 months, get them from whatever 2-3% or whatever that baseline was, really getting them up to at least a solid 10%, and many achieved more. They were able to get 15%, 20% or so, even beyond. And the interesting thing was, so it's doable, they could reproduce it, they could measure it. But I think the more important thing is after the second month within the training, usually they gradually got more and more into breakthroughs, personal breakthroughs that happened as a result, right? All of a sudden more aware, all of a sudden all this good stuff is happening. And so they were excited, and that kept them motivated and say, oh my goodness, this is great, right? Stress levels went down significantly and they felt good, and they got a lot of new insights out of this. They got a lot of new ideas, also more clarity. Usually, sometimes they were in difficult situation, decision making, and that awareness was basically helping them. This increased awareness so much that it has a really big impact then on their life. And so that was the cool thing to see as this LPA, this level of present awareness, was growing slowly, but also not necessarily steadily. It had like these little zigzag thing. This is usually how it goes, but there's an upward trajectory, right? And then they experienced individually some breakthroughs, smaller ones, bigger ones, and that basically convinced me that this is doable. It can be done systematically. It has a positive effect, and it's reproducible.
I really love that system, because whenever you track something, people become aware. Like as soon as I've had clients where, they like alcohol, and it's like, okay, I'm not going to tell you how many times to drink because I don't know what we got to change. What gets measured get managed, right? So I'm like, okay, just track your drinks. And then all of a sudden someone's like, okay, I got to change this. And the same thing with calorie tracking, when people just start tracking. One of the easiest ones to motivate people to move is when they get a little step counter, a little Fitbit, they will automatically want to walk more because of that biofeedback. Is like, I'm only at so many thousand steps. And I imagine the, level of awareness, once you've tracked it, it's like, hey, you're actually not as aware as you think you are. You can almost intuitively become, okay, you know what, maybe I should try this a little bit more. And so I'm super fascinated with that, because when it comes to focus, like being more in the moment, you literally will spend less time being anxious because you can only think of the present moment, right? Unless you have a job that just is extremely high intensity. For the most part, when we're talking about these kind of environments, and most workplace environments, we actually just need to really be focused on them. And you pull more enjoyment out of the moment because you're so present with it. That's what mindfulness is all about. And I think that's really cool that you created a system for people to track it. What I'm curious about, as you had mentioned, some of those challenges for like does this count, does that not count? Like, what were some of the challenges with allowing people to know, that counts and that doesn't count? What were some of the issues that people had with tracking?
Yeah, the tracking part at the beginning it requires a little bit of work, because that's exactly what you said. Does this count? Does this not count? And so they were saying, well, I'm running now, or I'm doing some sport activity. Does this count? And so I explained and shared more details around these scenarios. So I basically said pretty much everything you're doing when you're fully connected to the present moment means you're fully experiencing it. So if you're doing some rock climbing, there's a high chance that you're actually very present in the moment when you're in the mountain climbing up that wall, because if you're not present, you maybe very, very quickly fall down, right? Because you have to concentrate and you have to be focused and fully immersed. But let's say you do some light running, but then while you're running, there's all this thought activity, and you identify with the thinking, and then you're rehashing and planning, then you're actually not present. So it is when you really fully experience whatever it is, that thoughts are appearing, usually that is fine, they can appear, but as long as you're not identifying with them, that is the definition. Once you identify with them, then you're not connected anymore to the present moment. And I think they got the picture over time. And of course, then they asked me a few more questions around other scenarios, like if you're in a meeting with another person, And does this count? And I said, yeah, usually that counts if you're actually listening what the other person says, right? If you're not already thinking about the answer that you're going to reply while that person is speaking, but if you're actually fully focusing and basically fully there, actively listening, and it counts as well. And so there's a lot of things that can count towards it. And so that's why people learn how to, they get the hang out of this. It's almost like a game, right? In terms of, oh yeah, meeting. And so it's a great opportunity to collect mindful minutes, right? These are easy ways, like when they go in a meeting and they're actually paying attention. And if you ask the other participant at the end, I typically tell them, ask the participant after you did this, that you did this experiment, that you're trying to do better listening, if they felt a difference. And then usually the people will reply, oh yeah, there's a big difference. And so there is easy ways to bring in these mindful minutes. There's other like standard things you do every day that benefit from this, like brushing your teeth, taking a shower, eating, walking, right? So simple things that you're doing anyway, but usually you do them all on autopilot, right? If you brush your teeth, usually it goes in and out, right? 30 seconds. So that's for many the default. A dentist always tells you 2 minutes. There's a reason for that, because if you actually try to do this exercise later on today, maybe in the evening, and you try to brush your teeth and you do it mindfully, being fully there, being fully present, really feeling, sensing the teeth and everything, the gums. And if you do that, it actually takes 2 minutes, because you notice that, oh wait, this one I forgot. Here's more work. And you do it in a different pace. You do it being fully here, and then yeah, it takes 2 minutes. It's amazing. So this is how you can bring in 2 minutes, 2 mindful minutes. And a lot of these apps, I mentioned wearable tech. There's meditation apps. They also count mindful minutes, so you can get, when you use some of these like Calm, Headspace, and so on, they track mindful minutes easily for you, because the assumption is if you're doing a mindfulness exercise, you're actually then being there, right? You're actually doing that. And so this, you bring in more minutes, it's automatically tracked. And so then the tracking is not too difficult. You sit back in the evening, reflect, see based on your apps, right, what came in through automated tracking. And then you maybe took a few notes, what you basically accumulated otherwise over the day. And you add it up, and it doesn't have to be perfect. It's just you do it as good as possible. But this gives you usually a good number, right? It gives you this like insight on how much I'm actually fully there versus completely on autopilot, right? And I think this is when it comes to the tracking, I think it's evolving over time, and it's getting easier after maybe 2 or 3 weeks.
Really cool that you've helped people with this, because that whole idea of becoming awareness within, when you talk social concept, it's super important, because what you had said, when someone's talking, are you involved in it? Are you just actively listening, or are you already preparing your answer? And there's a huge difference. I really want to connect you with my friend, Dr. Ray Lavoie, because he studies flow research. And so he's kind of on the leading end of research right now. And one of the things that he looked at for his research was actually looking at improv comics, because improv comedy is all about the present moment. It's all about bringing the best of the present moment. And so what he had said was like two major things that really help, add to, the present awareness, and to be able to be in more flow state, which is a lot of what you're talking about, is to be curious. And when you're talking with someone, and this is a big improv comedy thing, it's yes and. It's like you have to really know what they're saying and be okay with what they're saying and be present with what they're saying, and then add to it. It's not denying it. It's not arguing it. And then that actually brings you very much more to that, okay, what can I build off of what they're saying? And it's a way to actually create this better chemistry within the relationship of that conversation. And so I was really curious, when you're helping these people with this must have made a big impact on the social culture. As you talk about being a mindful leader, this must be one of the major drivers to improve that social culture in all these workplaces that you helped out. Is that kind of what you saw?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and for me, this was a clear thing. I just didn't know at the beginning, how can you introduce this in a workplace? That was the big question. So how do you get leaders? And my approach initially, mindful leader is, so the idea is the mindful leader in the organization is the leader who uses awareness as a foundation. Mindfulness is a way, is an enabler. It's like cultivating awareness. It's a tool, so to speak. It's not an end game, basically, in itself. It's just helping to raise this awareness. And the question then was, yeah, what can you do and how can you get into this? And so back in these, I forgot, maybe it was in 2018, I came up with these, I call them now the 12 mindful leadership principles, and I published them on my blog. And because I figured there has to be some guidance, something that people can understand. It's not too complicated, it's intuitive. And so I wrote those mindful leadership principles down. And while I was working at Zalando, this major tech company here in Europe, in Berlin, I had a large leadership team at that point. Like my organization was the size of 400 people. And my leadership team was about 30, 35 leaders at that point. So it was a sizable organization. And that was the time when I actually introduced these mindful leadership principles at work. So I shared them with the leadership team and said, here, look, some ideas. And then we did some workshop on this, explored it. And it was great. So people were contributing, they gave feedback. And so I was shaping those leadership principles further. And in general, feedback was encouraging, it was positive. People all said, oh yeah, great, it makes completely sense, easy. And I said, great, then I give you a chance in the next few months, explore with these principles for yourself, see how they work for you. And then in a month or 2 months from now, give me some feedback. And I think the insight then after that time was that people were basically struggling. They pretty much, the feedback always was, oh yeah, it's clear, I know what it is, what I have to do, but I don't do it. Right? It was, and the problem was, and that's when it dawned to me, right? It was lack of awareness. They had pretty much everyone, right? They had lack of awareness because of the low LPA. The LPA, if it's like 2-3% or whatever low number, that is the key problem because there's such a low awareness. You're not becoming aware when you're not doing these principles. And so you're doing some stuff, you're basically in this execution mode, fully identified with your thinking activity, the busy mind. I sometimes say there's the busy mind, right? All this thoughts process going on. And then you're not aware anymore what you're doing pretty much as it's on autopilot. And so then you forget about these principles. And then later on, when there is this aha moment, or there is all of a sudden a little bit of awareness kicks back in. It's not that you're completely unaware the whole day. There's always these light moments. They come, sometimes small moments, but they're usually sufficient. And then in these little breaks of awareness, then you realize, oh wait, I wanted to. There was this thing. Maybe let's say. There is one, for instance, to stay present, right, or stay present in your actions, words, and your doings, pretty much. So basically, be here. To simplify it, right? There is one of those principles: be present, and that is very foundational one. It pretty much would describe all the others, but the others are a little bit more specific and different flavors. But the point is, you then become aware that, oh, wait, there was this thing. I wanted to actually try this to, for instance, be more present with what I'm doing. And then you become aware of it. And then you have maybe a few minutes until you fall back again in these subconscious, unconscious moments. And then it's forgotten again. And so this is how the game works. And so then the problem really was lack of awareness. And then the next question I had, well, what can you do to support them? How can people that's what motivated me. It seems like if they can grow their level of awareness, then they can actually fully live these mindful leadership principles. And then on an application level, there's all these benefits. They can reap all these benefits, like the organizations are in better shape. Usually, when there was a lot of experimentation done in parallel, I know from SAP, they were experimenting on large scale with thousands and thousands of employees, and they put them through all kinds of different mindfulness programs at work. And they were showing like really good numbers in terms of improvements to the health index, to productivity, and whatever. So they were already proving that this all works. And so the question here was, it was clear it works. But if you can actually support those leaders and help them become more aware, they can actually do a better job. And that is the case. And then for me, it was more, okay, now how to do it a little bit more systematic, efficient, right? Can I take a person here from low LPA, go through a program? So that was then also the demand from these guys. They said, help me achieve this in 3 or 4 months, right? And that was a big challenge, and I did a lot of experimentation. And then just this year, I launched a program, High Performance Mind, where then these leaders can really do this very systematically. It's like one of those fast-paced university courses there's some work you have to put in. It can be done, and if you're motivated enough, you can actually make it. But there is no free lunch, so there's actually work. It's work. Becoming more aware is work, indeed. It's not that you're doing a lot, but the emphasis is more on the being, just right, being here, being present. So it's less about doing, but more about being. And that is a challenge for many, but they get into it. And for some people, it takes a little bit longer. They need to get into the hang of it. But usually after a few weeks, they see already changes, right? And then once they achieve certain levels, then they graduate, right? So then they achieve mastery. But I think to get this done, they need support. So usually they can't do it alone. That's why usually if you have communities, if you allow some masterminding, or in my case, I support with coaching as well, then usually there's good chances that people can go through this. But so far, I haven't seen that in terms of, oh yeah, you give them this course or whatever, and then they self-study, then they go and do it. It's not going to work, my experience. So you need some accountability in there. Otherwise, it's hard.
Most things you do, right? Especially the ones that you're not already inclined to do. Most things, like you have to be a very motivated person to change your life or behavior. From training and nutrition, it's usually the forefront of some of those lifestyle changes. And unless you have some sort of support to guide you through it, people can change, but it is dramatically harder. And then when you have that coaching, like you say, the accountability, it just goes faster. And what I think is really interesting about your field here, with it being about mindfulness is, like you had mentioned, it's the forefront of where we're going with psychology, really, right? Because we're trying to get out of the anxious mind that is kind of jumping all over the place to the present mind that just manages the task that's in front of them and focuses on that task and becomes involved in that task and immersed in that task. And there's actually can be a lot less anxiety, because a lot of anxiety and fear is manifested problems that don't currently exist. And so when you're able to be more mindful, you're able to lower your stress levels, you're able to perform better on each and every task, and you actually will improve mood and all these things. And that's what I was really interested in, because, you have to approach these businesses and you have to say, well, I'm going to help you become more mindful. You even said when they tracked it and they stopped tracking, it's like, oh yeah, we become a lot less aware. And that's because like, it's kind of very similar to like the nutrition and training thing. If you do an intervention, it's like, hey, do nutrition and training, and you're there to guide them. They do it. Okay, we're good. And then just takes a little bit. Oh, you miss a day, miss 2 days. You start eating like you used to. You start not working out. And then it's like, oh, yeah, it's just kind of this thing you put off. Now, the one thing there is, at least with nutrition and training, people will be like, oh, I'm gaining weight, or I'm not feeling fit. And they get that biofeedback. what kind of consequence / what would be the benefit or motivator that you present to your people that you're working with? Like, very similar to training and nutrition. Like I said, the feedback's there. If you are not, being in shape, you're going to physically see it and feel it and emotionally feel it. But what kind of things do you point to, and what kind of benefits have you been able to prove to these companies and these leaders? Like, you're going to see way better performance. You're going to see less mood shifts to ensure that they stay motivated to stick to it. Because like you had said, if you lack the awareness that you're even having a problem, how do you ensure that they stay aware and they stay on it and they stay consistent with it?
Mhm. Yeah, there are several aspects to this. I think in terms of the benefit side, I identified several really strong benefits that a increased level of awareness will bring. If you think about awareness as the foundation for the mind, the mind usually I refer to as the software, the mind operating system. It's basically it's running on the brain, which is the hardware, right? And then it's producing an output, which is your personality, or I call it your ego, the egoic mind. So the software has a purpose. It produces who you believe you are, right? And the hardware, the body is there to support it. And so the benefits are usually the most tangible benefits are in the quality of your state of mind. So your mindset, basically, those are primarily key advantages. Like people usually, when I talk with them in the beginning, there's several scenarios. Most often, there's the busy mind as the underlying culprit, that people can't turn off their thinking activity. They're like constantly in this thinking and thinking. They can't turn off their mind, even when they got home in the evening with their family. They're still at work mentally. So they're still processing, and then they think about, oh, what should I do the next day? They think about their project work, and then they can't sleep. So the next thing then, so first a busy mind, and then the second thing is they can't sleep. They wake up in the middle of the night, and then again that thing comes on. And what good is it for if you wake up at 2 a.m. and then this thing is running, this rehashing again, all those thoughts for another hour or two. And finally you fall asleep, I don't know, at 4 a.m. only to get up at 5 or 6. And so it disrupts sleep quality. And so they have poor sleeping, and then they have no energy the next day, right? And so this all goes hand in hand. So decreasing the thought activity is a key thing for them to feel more calm, more relaxed, to actually being able to turn off the mind. And when you're at home with the family, it is, I refer to this as mental flexibility. So being more flexible, switching from focus to calm. And yeah, focus is just another one, being able to focus on something, staying in the flow, right? You mentioned the flow state before. This is another capability of a high performance mindset, really being able to, if you set yourself some task, I know people do, they set aside some time even, they say, now I have some hopefully uninterrupted time. And then they have some important work to do. Maybe they work on a presentation, some slide deck or whatever. They get started, but after 2 or 3 minutes, they get distracted. They can't even focus because the mind comes up again with some thinking activity that is not related to what they're currently doing. It distracts them, and then they start, right? They get away from the primary task, and then the distraction is so high they can't get stuff done. And so focus is for many a big problem. And so if I already combine those type of things related to the mindset, the calm state of mind, better focus, mental flexibility, there's a lot of benefits. But then this has also more benefits. Now it comes to the body, right? So the body usually is in a state of stress. Because all this thinking activity. The problem is scientific studies showed that a large portion, they're debating, is it 70, 80, 90%, usually is negative. So there's a lot of usually ground level negativity there. It's not, interestingly, I also tried to measure this and was experimenting there. And working with many leaders in this space, and it's not, I would say, there's a chance, maybe it's 50-50. Some people are really in the negative space, so they have self-doubt, they're insecure, they're not self-confident, they lack self-confidence. So there's this negativity that keeps them small and keeps them preventing from growing, become the best version of themselves. And it's basically the mind is in this negative feedback loop. It's not affecting everyone, but it's hard to tell if it's really what the science says. It's 70, 80, sometimes even 90%. It looks like it's a little bit lower, but nevertheless, negativity is a big deal. And that is causing then emotional stress. The stress, on the other hand, is spreading out in your whole body. Like each of your 30 billion cells in your body has basically receptors. And so they can actually sense these thoughts, right? Thoughts are basically energy. And they can sense this negative energy. I mean, isn't that amazing that on a cellular level, these cells, they're smart, they have receptors, and they can actually sense negative thoughts, right? Negative energy. And what happens then, the cell, once it receives this, it's for them, it's basically a signal of this distress. And so they go in a lockdown mode. They think, oh, there's some danger coming up. Whatever it is, let's lock down the cell. And so they go in a lockdown mode. That means nothing gets in, nothing gets out. And that's a big problem because nutrients, at the end of the day, they need resources to function properly, but they need nutrients, needs to get in. And then on the other side, metabolites, so waste products, toxins, and so on, need to get out. And it's not happening because the cell is in this lockdown mode. And so what's happening over time is it's, especially when it becomes chronic stress, like people get stressed most of the time, and then the body, most of the time in this lockdown mode, and the body can compensate for a while, but eventually there is a price to pay. And then this is when these stress symptoms start. It could start again with poor sleep, or it can start with other things like increased blood pressure, as an example. And if things, anxiety, right? And you basically, there's a lot of, if you Google stress symptoms, there's a long shopping list of things that can happen to the body. And that's what's happening then to the body. And if then people don't pay attention, again, if lack of awareness prevents them to actually from feeling their body. They have these symptoms, but they're not aware of them unless the intensity of these symptoms will get so strong, then it catches their attention at some point, right? If people got really sick or can't sleep anymore, whatever it is, some sickness, all of a sudden, then the body now has made a statement and say, look, now you have to pay attention. Then they become aware. And then and sometimes this is really also a key change for them all of a sudden, that something happens that all of a sudden they become aware. And then they're open all of a sudden as well to make changes, because now they see, it's probably not going to work what I'm doing here. I have to make some changes, whatever that is. And so you can see the benefits are on the body side, so that the body can function better and better support the brain at the end of the day is part of the body, better support the mind. And the mind, there's a lot of benefits as well that you can reap. And it's a long list of benefits. So, but usually there is a few, like the ones I mentioned earlier, around the stress levels, mental flexibility, calm state of mind. Those are the things that are very attractive because people become aware that this is really a problem for them. And I have some of these, usually I have these monthly meetings with leaders, and it's Connect. I do some teachings on this topic. And when they share stories, I mean, it's always sounds very similar, right? There is these issues that I just talked about. They're real, right? And when I do these surveys and ask these people to pinpoint some of those things, it's always clear that it's not just one of those symptoms that exists, but usually people associate with many of these symptoms. So it's a common, at least in those space where I was discussing this, in tech, there was definitely agreement that these issues are really happening.
really, really powerful stuff when you think about just the negative consequence of negative thoughts and how powerful and potent it is. Because I just remember hearing that it's somewhere near 10 times more potent. I remember hearing a sports psychologist talk about this, and he had said that the research actually said, like, for one negative thought, you need like 6 or 7 or maybe even 10 positive thoughts to even counterweigh it. So it's like almost like not helpful to think that I'm just going to think super positive thoughts to outweigh the negative. But if 50% of your thoughts are already negative, you're just still out of whack. Like, it's just, they're just so much more potent, especially when someone gets caught in those negative feedback loops, as you'd mentioned. They're self-propelling. They accelerate. And I've seen in people I know, people I care about, that like their mind just works against them constantly at a very like instinctual level. So it's so challenging for people. And it is really interesting that it wouldn't dawn on someone that, hey, if you're not in your head, you're more in a present state, there's less of a chance of you actually staying in negative thoughts. And this is a school of thought called neutral thinking. And this Jason Brooks came on my podcast. He was sports performance, and he talked about how if you work on neutral thinking, it's more about the action. It's more about just being present, right? And when people are debating, do I do this? Do I do that? And it's like, no, just do the action and say the words of the action that have no positive or negative consequence. There's just the action. And you end up more inclined to be in the correct action that you want, more in that flow state. And, you know, like you had mentioned, like the consequence on it physiologically is enormous. I think what I wanted a little bit more understanding. Now, I know when it comes to negative stress levels, you know, you can stimulate, you know, acetylcholine, like you can stimulate your epinephrine. I understand that. Like, is that kind of what you were talking about when cells go on lockdown? Because I guess I just haven't heard any research or anything understanding other than you will likely have more hormonal function and neurotransmitter function that will be more in the realm of people being really uptight. I just wasn't sure about what you meant by all cells being locked down. Did you see research in realms of that, or what were you really referring to with that?
Yeah, there's a lot of research out there in the field of epigenetics. It's basically the science around epigenetics is basically the science around there is on one side there's your DNA, your genes, your genome, and epigenetics at the end of the day is what I refer to as the software that is basically controlling those genes, the expression of those genes, right? And so epigenetics is basically influenced by the environment. So in the environment is everything basically surround us. But of course, our internal environment, our thinking, our mind is also part of the game. It produces energy. Every thought is energy, right? And so that's why interesting that the research showed that cells are aware, they can actually sense this energy, not just our thoughts, but also other forms of energy, right? So they're sensitive to this. And that's why, for instance, like EMF is a big topic. Right? This was people nowadays, when they hear EMF, electromagnetic frequencies, like the 4Gs, 5Gs, the Wi-Fi's and all that stuff, people now wake up and they realize, oh, there is something there and there's science that supports it. And now if you think about what's the foundation for EMF, at the end of the day, it is frequencies, right? It's radiation, it's frequencies, and it can be very high frequencies in that case. But it's affecting our cells. It's affecting us on cellular level because these cells are basically sensing this thing. Of course, they sense other things as well. They sense certain liquids, they sense hormones, right? If there's some adrenaline hormones or vitamin D hormones docking on or knocking, right, on in wanting to get in through the membrane, and then they go on these receptors. So there is the membrane, cell membrane at the end of the day is the brain of the cell because it gets these responses from the environment and then it does something, right? Either it lets these things in or not in or whatever. And so it's very interesting. And there's also a lot of studies around the importance of the membrane. So I got really interested in these things in the past few years because I figured, because before that, similar what you just mentioned. I always thought, yeah, there's all these hormones, stress hormones, neurotransmitters are not balanced. But why is this actually the case? Why is this causing this problem for the body? Right? And this, when you actually go into the epigenetics and you look at the impact of these signals from the environment on a cellular level, that when it gets interesting, and that explains then a lot, right? That actually explains why this negative thinking is not good for you, right? Before that, people were saying, yeah, if you think negative things, you're getting into this pessimistic mode and so on. So they were just focusing on the mind, right? But the impact on this negative stuff is at the end of the day the body. The body gets to process these thoughts. The body is just a reflection of what the mind is doing. And that's why if you have a healthy mindset, a positive mindset, usually the body gets the signal as well, and then usually is also in a pretty good state, right? But I mean, it's clear when you do this negativity, and if it's for a longer period of time, when you're getting into this space, then yeah, the body has to pay a price for this. And I know because myself, I was in a bad state of mind more than 10 years ago. So all this stuff what I'm talking about, I experienced myself. So this is why I know what I basically how it feels and what it does. But at that point, of course, I didn't have this knowledge yet, and I didn't know what to do and how to tackle it, and all these relationships between the thinking and the body and everything. Yeah, there's exciting science out there, and I think if someone wants to go in this space of epigenetics, there's a lot of research that can be found. And then also 10 years ago, so this whole area of biohacking also started spreading, basically experimenting in a more agile manner with your own biology, right? Also based on science and also based on measurements. Dave Asprey is a big, I mean, he's considered the father of biohacking in Wikipedia, I think. But it's clear that so Dave and these guys, they were also based on science. They were looking at how does the body work, right? And what is functional medicine is a good one that goes into these things. But I think when you bring in the dimension of the mind, when you now go into neuroscience, and then you learn about all those different aspects of mind management, for instance, how to debug the mind, how to reprogram your subconscious. I mean, there's so many different methods out there and things, and they have a tremendous effect, not just on the mind, but then also on the body. So that's why usually when people say they want more energy, this is a good example. More energy means usually the body needs to be in good shape. That goes back on cellular level to your mitochondria, so those little organelles in your cell that produce the energy. And so you need more of those mitochondria to power the cells with more energy. You need better quality also of these mitochondria. And that means, at the end of the day, it is I think it's important, therefore, to help our mitochondria flourish, right? And of course, how can they flourish? Well, on one side, obviously, you have to feed them, give them some exercise, good nutrition. So all the typical stuff, sleep well, right? The typical things that you see out there. But another aspect is you have to minimize stressors, in particular emotional stress. Of course, there's other type of stressors, but emotional stressors, they at the end of the day affect also the quality of your mitochondria. It's amazing, right? And so that's why the impact of a healthy mindset is significant, and that's why it's even more important. First, focus on awareness. Awareness is the key foundation. Become aware that the mind is not doing well. Become aware of your blind spots, your shortcomings, your reactive patterns, your limiting thoughts. Become aware of them. Then use neuroscience to basically upgrade the mind. There's neurofeedback, there's all kind of cool things you can do. And of course, meditation and some of these techniques help you to upgrade the mind. And then you can start working on the body, because now it's much easier. Biohacking, I think, is not even doable if there is limited awareness and there is a mind that is basically in a bad state, right? Because if the mind constantly triggers these type of stressors, you can do as much healthy stuff, what you think to be healthy stuff, it's not going to work because the body still has to compensate for all the turmoil in your mind. That's why the order is important: awareness, mind, and then body.
Absolutely. The body and mind are it's such an overlap that they're basically the same thing, but we try to identify them different. Possibly because you can do a lot, people can get to a state where they can just only have their mind, but it is so overlapping. And how much I love that you're really approaching with epigenetics and making people really realize that it is it's this echoing throughout your whole body when you have those negative thoughts as a consequence. And if you want more energy, well, you're going to feel energy, and you feel it a lot in your mind, but you're actually even tapping into some other things when you talk about the subconscious mind, because that is talking about physical vibrations within our body that we barely comprehend why we do things. And you look back at something, why did I do that? And you felt it. And it's this subconscious level of thinking that we are so unaware of. And if we can pull more awareness to these things, if we can start to pay attention to when we're doing these things, you might be able to pull more from understanding yourself as a person. Well, one last thing before we wrap up here, because it's been a great conversation, but this is just something I've been personally playing with, because I do love the idea of being more present. I was getting into a really distracted mind, podcasts, TV, all that stuff. And so I pulled away from all of that in the fall. And then I was just like, okay, be with your thoughts more. When you're working out, be with your thoughts more. When you're driving, and like, there is to be aware, but then there's also time for thoughts, for thinking, for just allow yourself to digest thoughts. And I don't hear a lot of people talking about this, so that's why I was really curious about it. Like when I go for walks, sometimes it's to be mindful, but sometimes it is so that I do give myself time to think, because I find when, like, at the end of the day, when you go to hit that pillow, if I haven't had like a half hour or 45 minutes to think about my day I've had, or think about the next day, and I haven't had time, and I call this term digesting your thoughts, because you got to take your feelings you physically feel inside you, they're rolling around in your brain, put them right in front of you and be like, that this is what it is. Then by the time I hit the pillow, it's like, okay, I can be more restful. And I'm just curious if you've utilized this strategy or heard anyone talk about it, because to me, it came from a Stoic principle of always make sure you meditate about your day once a day at the end of the day, in order to actually just have a more peaceful mind. So I was curious if you came across this at all, or try to utilize this practice for some of your clients.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I'm still a little bit on the fence in terms of what makes the most sense here. But the way I see it is that too much thinking activity usually is not that helpful. So the mind, the logical mind, the thinking mind is usually very good at problem solving, processing. It is using the past to process the information that is currently at hand, and then it can come up for a solution. So let's say you have a mathematical problem, like back in school in these old days, right? And you get used to the problem. And then, so now you use the thinking mind to, based on the knowledge that you learned about the rules and how to process these numbers, how to use these operators, and so on. And this is the thinking mind now in action, and it comes back hopefully with a solution. But in business, most of the time, or when we're working on some of these problems, this is not really what is then that successful. So these type of things, when you then use the thinking mind for this, usually leads to mediocre or suboptimal results, because there is no creativity in it. So this, as I said, the thinking mind can process facts that are there. And so what you want usually, or what really makes this mediocre result a stellar or like a unique or some amazing result, there is usually some creativity in there. And creativity is something new. That's what the name already says. It's creative. It's something new. It's something novel. And so this, for instance, when I was working back in these old days there in the Silicon Valley, I found a lot of patents, so inventions. right? And there is obviously, you can only find a patent if there's something innovative there. So there's innovation, there is something that you do, that you're doing in a new way. And if I think about this, it's not a thinking process, or so the thinking mind is not that important actually. What's more important is stillness, being quiet, meditating, for instance. But you can meditate in different ways. It doesn't have means you have to sit there in, I don't know, and eyes closed and whatever. I mean, more formal. Meditate can mean you take a shower, or meditate can mean you go through a walk through the forest in nature. It can be very inspiring. And then you set yourself an intention. The intention could be a problem that you want to solve, maybe, right? There's an intent. You set yourself an intent for this meditation. And that's it. And then you go in stillness, and then you don't think. Right? If thoughts are coming up, observe them, but don't identify with them. Let them flow by. And then usually there's less and less thoughts coming. And this is the nature of meditation, is don't get identified with these thoughts. Just accept them when they come by. Let them, like clouds, fly by. So don't think too much. Don't think too hard. And then usually there is the really creative ideas that come out of this. They're out of a deep state of knowing. All of a sudden, there is this idea, or there is this, there is this creative thing that came up. I'm not saying it's a creative thought. I'm just saying there is something that came up. And then, so there is a spark of creativity. Maybe that is a good word, a spark of creativity that happens. So this is something new. And this came out of your stillness. And then in the next step, immediately, of course, this happens so fast. I think what I believe then in the next stage, and then starts to shape it, starts to interpret it, starts to wield and get it in iterate on it, right? So, but the initial spark comes out of stillness. That's creativity in action, and that's when you do this. Let's say some jogging as an example. I think the trick here is, what worked very well for me is set myself an intention before I run. That's what I did in the past, and that's how I actually came up with all these inventions. It was always because I didn't know at that point how this worked out. It wasn't that there was a lot of thinking activity. It was actually the opposite. It was no thinking. Then I had these answers. Then I had this creativity, and it just popped in, right? There, all of a sudden, there it is. And then, then after that, once I had something that interesting, right? So the first thing is, what is this? This sounds interesting, right? So you pretty much got the spark, and then the mind takes over as processing it. Interesting. And then you start all kind of scenarios. You pretty much vet the idea. Is it actually useful? Is it helpful? And so on. You then usually there is this whole idea of idea engineering, right? That you then, once you have something like this, you get feedback from others, you go over it and you test it and validate it. But this is the thinking mind in action. The creativity is the still mind. And the still mind you can train, and pretty much to what I said at the beginning, by raising awareness, by cultivating more awareness through mindfulness techniques, whatever they are, but increasing your LPA, going back to the beginning of the show, right? Increase your mindful minutes, and then a lot of good things are basically going to happen. That's my experience.
Yeah, I think we're pretty close to the same idea there. But what you actually articulated really well is that it's one thing to be like going with an intention for a thought process. Like, this is an intention of what I'm thinking about. And that's actually kind of what I was pointing to as well, is like, I think when we're trying to determine and problem solve, what can happen is distracted thoughts or anxious thoughts or problematic thoughts or things that actually just don't help the solution. Or you think, okay, I'm thinking of this, that, and then you're thinking of something altogether, different topic. And so unless you have this skill to be mindful, skill to be present within that thinking pattern of whatever you're trying to problem solve, you're going to have too many thoughts come in and out. So I'm in total agreement that being mindfully aware and having an intent for your thought process, whatever you're trying to problem solve. And I agree that it's almost going to be more intuitive for that spark of inspiration and creativity to come out of it. It's going to be more clear cut. So I totally know what you mean. And I can see how that is a much more advantageous way to spend time in a meditative state to try to actually help yourself figure out those problems. So I really like how you put that together. Well, this has actually been a really cool deep dive on the mind. I think we've really discovered, especially some really cool tactics, with the KPIs to be able to put together mindful minutes, and we talked about all the problems with it. So I really appreciate you coming on the show. Why don't you let the listeners know where they can find more about you and about your Mindful Leader courses and your book and everything like that?
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. And I thought there is some good, looking back, there were some good discussions around these topics. So I encourage everyone to, if you have a chance, go back to some of those ideas, but most importantly, take some action. That's always the most important. Don't just consume it, right? But actually think about concretely, like how you can, for yourself, maybe introduce more mindful minutes in your day. Maybe this is the task, the takeaway task here, the homework, so to speak. How can you introduce more mindful minutes, more awareness in your life, and then see what happens? And I compiled over the years many videos on this topics, resources. It's the mindfulleader.net. This is where you can find all that stuff. There's a link to my YouTube channel, there's podcast, all the good stuff where you can, and my blog obviously is also there, the mindfulleader.net. And definitely check it out and see if you can use some of those resources.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kraft. Like I say, I think these resources are very helpful, and it's really that main piece of the puzzle. I always talk about training and nutrition with my clients, but I always tell them that nothing matters without the mind, because that's where we determine if it matters. So it's imperative to health, and we are in the forefront of the mental health era. As much as we realize that there's unfortunate health consequences with poor training and nutrition, it is the mental health era that's going to really determine how well we do in the future here. So people like you are really on the forefront of helping us dramatically. So thank you so much for this information, and thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much again to Dr. Kraft. I really enjoyed that because he really gave some good depiction on not just the opportunity to really want to use this. So we really talked about all the benefits that come from it that are kind of clear, but it's very similar to trying to explain to someone why you want to do exercise if you don't currently exercise. Like, there's benefits, we know this, but to really draw into the level of how many other benefits there are and the consequences to not doing things will affect you physically, right? Will affect your health. It'll affect cells in your body. And it was really interesting to hear him talk about the epigenetics. And I actually knew that he was into biohacking and epigenetics, and we didn't really even get to scratch the surface too deep on that. But off air, we talked about it a little bit. And I'm going to put in the show notes that he has a website about epigenetics. And you can check that in the show notes because it's really interesting, because that's where he does specialize more now. And it's super important to know this stuff because epigenetics is above your current gene expression. It's how your DNA gets expressed in your environment. And so some things, genes can turn on and off based on what the environment gives it. So, for example, you might have a parent who is genetically like obese and all this stuff, right? But depending on your environment, maybe you have their genetics, but the environment you're in does not make you obese. You actually become a very fit person. So the genetic expression becomes different, how it interacted with your environment. And so he dives into more of like, how micronutrients are affecting it, and understanding that micronutrients, meaning, vitamins and minerals, food for your immune system and your cell functions, they need each other. So vitamin A needs vitamin B6 and vitamin B12. These things are cofactors. These things actually work off each other for all the cells to work effectively. So he dives into all that stuff as well, not just the mindfulness, which is really cool. I think how he's really narrowing down these ideas of being involved, even with talking to him about being mindful. made me want to pay more attention to the conversation and be more attentive. And it creates more excitement and engagement and enjoyment in each and every conversation that you have. So I want you to try this today. You're listening to this podcast, so you should try what happens when you don't have to necessarily track them. He is about KPIs and tracking the minutes, but just try to not track it first and just go in to try to be aware as much as you can. Immerse yourself into each and every task. It doesn't even matter if you're cutting the grass, if you're shoveling your snow, if you're whatever you're doing, cleaning, brushing your teeth. What happens to your mind when you're immersed in a task? Is it stressed? Is it like more negative, or is it more just that neutral thinking? And that's what I wanted to pull back to. If you haven't listened to it, listen to the episode with Jason Brooks, because he talks about neutral thinking. And it's because of what I had mentioned on this episode. We have so much potency to negativity. One negative thought is as powerful as like 5 to 7 positive thoughts. And not to mention, if you don't feel those positive thoughts, it's not going to work. So if we have just more neutral thinking, which would be more present, what's going on right now, it's not negative or positive. It's just, this is what I'm doing right now. This is the task. We would naturally eliminate a lot more negative thought patterns, right? Which we can't win the battle of just by having more positive thought patterns. So it really is a great solution to so many problems that we currently have. And then, he did give me even more guidance on what I've been experiencing, which is trying to allow myself to think more, but to think constructively, to problem solve, but to have a very specific intent for those thought patterns. And I know exactly what he's talking about, because I drive without a radio. I will go for walks without music, and I'll work out without music. But if I don't have an intention for what I plan on thinking about, I'm just going to let myself think. It's going to be random. It's going to be chaotic, and it's not going to solve too much. But if you go in with intentions on what you're going to think and try to digest your thoughts on, that's a whole different ballgame. You're going to perform better on whatever the task is that you're trying to think of and problem solve for. So I think there's a lot of really good knowledge here. I'm really excited to dive into some of the stuff that he has on his website myself personally. I really recommend that you try to, as you mentioned, put in some mindful minutes. I think I might start tracking it myself, because it is your performance. It's how good you're going to do at your job. It's how much more focused, less chance of negative thinking, and you're going to be able to get that much more out of each and every day if you're mindful with it. So I hope you learned a lot today. I think I learned some really good tactics that I'm going to try to utilize, and it made me aware again of how I wasn't as mindful as I really like to think I am. And I need to come back to being aware of these moments, being more mindful in each moment, because there's more to offer each and every moment if we pay attention to it. Because if you don't, life's going to fly by, right? Pay attention to life and it won't fly by so fast. And just for a little really simple example of that is, if you haven't tried meditation, try it. Try it for 3 minutes, and you're going to notice how intense 3 minutes is, because it goes by super slow if you're trying to think of one thing. Now, if you're really mindful and thinking about tasks, they don't necessarily fly by, but you become immersed in them. And that's what Ray would really talk about with flow research, is like you become immersed in it where time is irrelevant, which is actually a good thing, because you're so involved in wanting to be a part of that task that if time's irrelevant, then clearly you're emotionally involved, and the odds of you actually enjoying it are dramatically higher. And this could be work, this could be with your relationships, this could be with sport performance or performance of anything. And again, it makes us far more likely to enjoy and have a healthy mindset with everything in our environment. So I hope you learned a lot today. I hope you try some mindful minutes, and this will help that lifestyle ambition that you're going after, because, my friend, it is not about the pursuit of happiness, but it's about the happiness within that pursuit. And I'll catch you next time.